So this week, we are in week 3, and our topic for this week is congruency. We're actually going to have two parts to this. So the first part is just going to be thinking about what the difference is between congruency and alignment. So congruency is a key underpinning of a guaranteed and viable curriculum. But unfortunately, it's one of those words in education that gets thrown around a lot, but people really don't have a true understanding of what it means. Or if you ask different people what the thought is behind congruency, they'll all have different definitions about that. So let's think a little bit more about what actually is congruency. A lot of times people confuse congruency with alignment. And although those two terms are related, they are not the same thing. They're not synonyms. They're two very different things. And so alignment, all that means is that what we're teaching or assessing, as the case may be, is just directly related to a portion or a piece of the standard. That's it. It's just related to part of it, a little piece of it. So, to be quite honest with you, we have gotten really good nationwide over the last couple of decades under standards based instruction at being aligned. At this point, most teachers understand what their standards are for their content area or their grade level and have at least a decent understanding of what those standards are. And they understand that that is what they're supposed to be teaching in the classroom. So if we go into a classroom on any given day, it's very likely that we're going to see instruction that is aligned. Unfortunately, what we haven't given a lot of thought to is not necessarily alignment, but true congruency. So when we think about congruency, if we think about standards, standards are very large, complex statements of student learning. And if you think about those, when we consider the idea of true standards-based instruction, we cannot teach a standard in a class period. Standards are too big, too complex, take too much time, they go too deep. So with the way that we have school designed in class periods or in days, we can't teach true mastery of a standard in just one day. In fact, most standards take several days, and some of the most complex standards might even take weeks or revisiting over several units before we reach true mastery. So congruency is this idea of an intentional relationship between all parts of the standard or target. So when I'm talking about congruency, I'm thinking about the standard as a whole. Now, that is a little bit problematic in education because I have to think about the standard as a whole, and I have to make sure that I'm designing my instructions so that it approaches the entire standard. But because I'm locked into teaching within a class period or blocks of time, I am forced to take that standard and break it down into chunks. Some people call this deconstructing. I personally think that the idea of deconstructing standards is kind of a misconception and actually even a mistake in the way that we think about approaching standards. Because when we deconstruct, what we're thinking about is taking a standard and breaking it down into little bitty pieces and parts, and then that's it. The problem is that all of those pieces and parts have to be interconnected and put together so that students understand how those pieces and parts relate so that no pieces and parts get left out, because that can happen sometimes when I'm deconstructing standards, and that I understand how the complexity within the standard builds over time. So congruency is all about keeping my eye on the standard as a whole in its entirety, and then making sure that I'm designing lessons that scaffold and build to the level that is intended by the standard. So it might be easier to think about a visual. This is alignment. This is what happens when we deconstruct standards. We take the standards, we break them apart into little teeny tiny pieces and chunks so that we can manage those in a class period. If that is all I do, then I've got a problem because all I'm looking at are little bitty pieces and parts. And then what might happen is on one day, I'm looking at one learning target or one little bitty piece and part. And then another day, I'm looking at another piece and part. And another day, I'm looking at another piece and part. And then students, I might even be formatively assessing, I should be formatively assessing them on the pieces and the parts. And they do great on the little bitty pieces and parts. Then when I get to the end of the unit, I give them a summative assessment And usually our summatives are pretty good at assessing the standard at the level that it's intended to be assessed at, because most of us have had some pretty decent assessment training or have been kind of through that process. And then what happens is that the student bombs the summative assessment. And we get frustrated with them because we're like, how can you bomb this assessment? Because you did great on all of these little bitty formative assessments that we had throughout the unit. You knew this all throughout the unit. How can you not know it now? Well, the problem is that we're probably assessing them at a higher or more rigorous or more complex level than we ever instructed them or asked them to perform at, because we were looking at the standard in pieces and parts instead of thinking about how that fit together. And most students, a few can, but most students can't take those pieces and parts and put them together and understand how they all fit together without some guidance. So it requires a different way of thinking in terms of our mindset about how we go about approaching and designing an instruction. So instead of thinking like this, we want to kind of move away from the idea of deconstructing. And instead, we want to really think about the idea of reconstructing and scaffolding. So we want to think more like this. Congruency is the idea that I have to think about the whole standard in mind. And over the course of the unit, however long that unit happens to be, I'm going to continually build the complexity of instruction so that students are continually building on their knowledge from the prior lesson. So I have to think about if this is where students need to be by the end of the unit to demonstrate mastery of the standard, then what's my starting point? How do I kind of back map that down to what my good starting point is? So initially, your first target, your first couple of targets might be what is seemingly lower level because we have to start from kind of their ground or their basis, their basic learning, and then we start building on that over time. And the learning and the way that we're asking them to demonstrate that learning, it's more difficult and more complex over time as they start grappling with more and more of the content. So congruency is more thinking about building complexity over time than it is about thinking about all the little pieces and parts. So each of these blue arrows typically represents a formative assessment sequence. So if I am building from target to target to target to congruency with the standard, I do need to be formatively assessing to see if at least the majority of my students are ready to move on as a class. If I've got students that are completely bombing the assessments, and I need to be thinking about what I need to be doing to reteach before I move on to that next target. Because the idea of congruency is that if we're building in complexity, they have to master the things that come before, or at least have good familiarity of the things that come before I can move on to the next target. So I kind of have to think about that until congruency is reached. So congruency is really important in a guaranteed and viable curriculum because one of the things that we have talked about with guaranteed and viable curriculum is it ensures that all students have the opportunity to learn and master the material. And that basically is the standards. And if we're not getting to the level that the standards are intended for our student learning to get at, then we're already kind of creating some unintentional learning gaps along the way. So hopefully you have a little better understanding now of the difference between congruency and alignment. In just a minute when you finish this one, you can go on to the second part. There's a part 2 of the lecture. And what we're going to do is put this into practice where we're actually going to look at some examples of some things going on in classrooms and deciding if they're actually congruent with the lesson target for the day.